and welcome back to This Is Our Story. You are joined by me, Kieran, and once again by my sister, Briar. Hello. Hello to you, Briar. And how are you doing on this, well, for us is a fine evening. For me on this side of the Tasman, it's a nice warm evening. How's it doing?
It's actually nice here too. Very nice and mild.
Well, if you've just joined us, just a quick summary of what we have covered so far in our first couple of episodes. So in the first episode, we talked about our early years growing up in Kaikohe. We covered some of the topics of growing up in a little kind of country town and being surrounded by a very interesting mix of people of different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds and such. And we talked a little bit about how that affected us, and a little bit about how our background of or understanding of race, etc., affected how we grew up later on. And in our second episode, we covered our move to Kirikiri, slightly breezed over it, some of our early school years as well, and we kind of finished off talking a bit about our time at Kirikiri Christian School, which was a tiny Christian school of approximately about 60 students, I think, when we first joined. And we talked a little bit about the curriculum system there and how kind of crazy it was and how Christianified. I just made that up. Should probably write that down. Just to how kind of crazy it was in that respect. And that was about where we left off and we're about to kind of get into the topic of growing up in our church, which was a very central part of our lives as a central part of our family, is what I was trying to say. However, I mean, that's a big, deep topic. But before we get into that, we are introducing a segment called, for lack of a better title, Story Time. And we are going to just kind of cover some things before we get into the dark and heavy stuff. Just share some stories or memories from our childhood or just from our lives in general that were just kind of entertaining or just kind of fun, just to keep things light. And I mean, the purpose of this podcast in the very beginning was to help us kind of remember stories from our youth and kind of enjoy remembering the past. And so it's nice to kind of talk about those fun things, and we do have a lot of those type of stories to tell. Anyway, so the topic of this particular story time is pastimes, the things that we got up to when we were young. I mean, there are plenty to share here, but I've chosen one for myself in particular, and Brian has as well. So I'm going to get Brian, do you want to just share a little bit about what your pastimes were growing up? And we're kind of focusing, I suppose, at the moment on our kind of teenage years in particular.
Well, to be honest, most of my spare time was spent with my horses that I had. So I didn't have so many friends, and none of them were horsey. So a lot of my spare time was spent riding on the farm, which was like a big love of mine, obviously. I used to ride from our farm onto the back of a neighbour's farm to the pony club because, our parents couldn't afford to have a float to take me to pony club. So that was a good half-hour ride, but I loved it. I absolutely loved going there. But the rest of my time, I did have a best friend who maybe we'll introduce at some point. We met when we first started the Christian school. If I remember correctly, our first day was the same.
Yeah, I think so.
First day, and I was 9 when I met her, and we're still friends to this day. But we spent a lot of time together at her place mostly.
Well, it was just around the corner.
Yeah, she had a big family. There was 5 of the kids, and so I spent a lot of my time there. And we had such vivid imaginations. We spent a lot of time writing stories and dressing up. And back then, when there was, I think it was like a VHS videotape, we used to record ourselves pretending to be like American news reporters.
I remember that. Oh my God. I remember very clearly the American accent.
Yes, and
she was obsessed with it.
Her younger brother was actually quite tech savvy, so he was, I don't know if he edited it or what, but he anyway got it to the computer for us. But I wish to this day that we could go back and revisit those videos, but of course they don't exist anymore because it would have been on a floppy disk or something, back in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
when that was a thing. So we spent a lot of time doing that. We used to walk up and down our road and pretend like we were part of this, what do you call it, like sort of reality that didn't exist. Like we were talking about people that we didn't know, and oh, did you hear the latest gossip? So and so is pregnant now, and
I do. I remember. Things was fairly common knowledge at the time, but I had a bit of a crush on it because she was so creative, and I was also very creative at that time, and so we had this kind of quote unquote connection. At least I thought so, because while she was kind of imagining stories, I was writing them as well. I remember we used to write stories and swap them for each other to read, and I was always trying to be impressive with my stories. My stories probably had a little bit more gore than hers.
Well, ours was,
and she had a natural gift for stories, whereas I was just kind of probably more up in the clouds.
Well, ours was, I don't know where we got these ideas from, because neither of our families had TV, so it's not like we watched American TV programs, but our story was based around Calvin High, where we went to this high school. So we literally would talk as if we were these characters. We had different names and like just made the craziest shit up. And again, those stories, they were all handwritten, so they'd be somewhere. I'd love to read through it again, but we always thought
I remember because I wrote a story as well that was about, it was something French. I don't know if you remember that. It was a French title or something, and I put all of us in the story, and it was quite funny. So I remember trying to be entertaining quite a lot, and I really wanted to impress her with my entertaining qualities. I do remember that.
Well, it'll be interesting to get her take on that. Maybe we'll have to call her and and tell her all this. Might be news to her.
Well, because while you guys were creating stories like that, I was actually doing the same, but in a very different way. I don't know if you remember, I had a cassette player, an old cassette player where I could record.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I would record these stories or imaginative, I don't know, monologues or dialogues, depending on whether I could get a friend involved or not, with these crazy character names like Colonel Waxen Ear, and that's the only one I can remember because that's the one Mum always reminds me about. And I don't remember the other ones, but they're always kind of really clever, ridiculous names of these in these characters. But they would be doing all sorts of things like having war games and spies and just lots of shooting and stuff with sound effects included.
I do actually have a memory of you and your friend Daniel sitting on the swing chair that we had outside at our house in Pakaraka, and you were sitting there with your... Did you have a microphone, or was it just straight into the cassette player?
No, it was just one of those big, massive cassette players where we had like a microphone built in.
And you were sat there swinging on the chair, laughing and doing your stories together.
Oh, we had a great time. We thought it was hilarious. I don't know if it was actually funny to anybody else, but...
How funny would it be, though, to go back and listen to those?
Yeah, because I think you had them after I left home, those tapes. Because Mum used to tell me how you used to listen to them when I left for university.
Cringy.
And she used to tell me about how much you missed me after I left home, and you would just sit in your room and listen to the
her
tapes.
words, not mine.
Never
Surely I didn't miss you.
But I mean, in terms of pastimes, because I didn't have many friends either, but I mean, that was just the nature of growing up in, a small town in a very small bubble. And also I think
because we lived rurally as well, probably, a lot of our friends lived in town, so it was too far. Yeah,
it was quite a mission for them to come out to us. In distance-wise, in terms of where I live now or the places I've lived in since then,
it wouldn't be a big deal.
It's nothing. It's like 10 minutes to town. But back then, it's basically the middle of nowhere. No one would want to drive out there.
No. Or no one's mum would want to play taxi to go all the way out there.
No. Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time entertaining myself. There was a lot of books, of course, that I read. There were the War Commando comics, which I still have, actually.
Do you remember we used to have a subscription every month?
Yeah.
You had the war ones, and I always chose a horsey magazine. And when we'd go into town, we'd go to the bookshop and we'd collect our magazine or comic book from that month.
Hundreds of them, and I sold a couple of boxes. I still have 2 boxes of them that are stored currently in New Zealand. So I just can't bring myself to part with them. I mean, I don't know what to do with them.
Some value now.
Oh, I've tried, not really. give it another 20 years maybe. Yeah, well, I think that's what I'm holding on for. Like, I'll hold on to them until they're worth something. But yeah, probably nothing really. But what I would often do is just take my air rifle. The house that we were in, we didn't own it. We were just renting it. And I described this house a little bit in the promo for this podcast. But we were on
it was an old
big
homestead.
house. It was a 2-story house with 5 bedrooms. 6 bedrooms.
Yeah, 3.
And it was a farmhouse. I don't know if that makes it any easier to imagine, but it was big.
It's described as a homestead.
Yeah, it was quite an old home, almost like a historic landmark for the area. Had a big section, like about an acre, of lawn and gardens, and around that there were another few acres which had animals, including Bry's horses. But that small lifestyle block kind of sat on hundreds of acres that were surrounding, that we kind of had free access to as kids. At some point, somebody asked somebody if we were allowed, and I felt like I took a little bit of license there.
Back in the day, though, I guess, we were just a couple of kids roaming on the farm. It wasn't a big deal. Like, nowadays people would be like, get off our property, but, no one really cared. We weren't doing any harm.
I mean, they probably should have, to be honest. I mean, the fact I was just literally wandering off on my own with an air rifle that, as air rifles go, was kind of powerful, and it definitely could have hurt a person. I had quite a lot of misadventures with that particular rifle. So it belonged to the owners of the house, and they had just said that I could use it. And so I would go off and then just shoot stuff, or kind of almost anything that crossed my path. Like,
including
to my embarrassment, I did shoot cows. Because I would have these imaginary battles in my mind, right? And all the cows were the enemy, of course, trying to get me. And unsurprisingly, they didn't like this and would try and come closer. And of course, that would get me even more excited, trying to shoot them and stave them off. Get rid of the enemy!
But it was just little
one-man
pallets,
army,
though, wasn't it? But
yeah, it was. They were metal pallets, so like the pointed ones normally. So they would have hurt. They would have stung for sure. Kids don't try this at home. Probably
and
could.
You definitely got in trouble for aiming from the deck.
At one point, because this was a long time after I'd been using the air rifle for all sorts of things I shouldn't have been doing, because Mum wasn't aware, shooting birds and just shooting stuff without taking, I had no training on what was proper use or not. And at one point, I shot down range on the lawn. We had a possum trap on the lawn, and I shot it from the other end of the lawn. And our boarder at the time, remember Clayton? He was just sitting there because the possum trap was about 3 meters away from the stairs to the deck, and I shot it, and he was like, "What the hell?" I have a real fright. And he reported. He told on me basically, and then the air rifle went away, never to be seen again.
Oh, is that what happened to it?
Yeah, that was. I definitely snuck it out. We spent so much time at home without Mum and Dad around when they were at work. So, what were they going to do? Had no friends.
No what?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time just exploring the farm for hours and hours on end, catching eels in the creek, and just doing lots of walks all over the place. I don't know. I got to know the place pretty well, and there were other pastimes I had as well, like sport, and played soccer for all of my teenage years. But yeah, most of the time I probably spent on my own, to be honest.
But I think also because we had a big house, lots of our friends who were what we'd call townies, they were like, whoa, like you've got such a cool house. So we did have occasional weekends where like a whole bunch of friends, probably most of them were just, people that were friends of friends, to be honest. Like none of them were really our close friends, but we loved hosting people. Yeah. And we had a massive house, so we would just have big sleepovers with all these people. And I don't know how Mum and Dad tolerated it, to be honest, because there was a lot of us sometimes, and probably quite rowdy, and all sleeping in the lounge.
This is probably a good time to really segue into our conversation about church, because most of the people that came over were involved in our church or school at the very least. Like all of my friends came from that church/school circle. And as we explained last time, right, the school was a part of the church, so it was kind of hard to separate the two.
And it was also what mum and dad allowed. They were the people that they agreed that we could hang out with. It wasn't, a random selection of people. It was.
I mean, we didn't know.
They were kind of
no
vetted,
idea.
Weren't they?
every now and then we would meet other people outside of our church circle, like maybe people from other churches or people who were kind of in church but kind of weren't. And I think also, as I mentioned last time, my best friend Oliver, right, we drifted apart because he wasn't in that church circle. They were from an Anglican church, I believe.
English. They were English, and I think they were.
Yeah.
I think they're from
and
England.
they were just very different, very kind of traditional, and it wasn't our family's vibe, and we just drifted apart. But I guess maybe we could just take some time to describe the church that we went to, which became such a big part of our lives. It was an Assemblies of God church, and I don't know, looking back, maybe a couple of hundred people at its height.
Yeah.
It wasn't a kind of consistent number through the years that we were there, but between 100 and 200, I would say, quite consistently. And Assemblies of God is kind of more on the evangelical, if you're talking about on the slide of the slider of Christianity, versus traditional versus liberal. We're kind of swaying more across to the left, I suppose, on the liberal side of Christianity, a little bit more. The music was supposed to be a little bit more fun, and it was still in the 90s and the early 2000s that we're talking about. So it wasn't crazy or anything, but it was generally a little bit more fun than, say, a traditional ritualized church service. There was, the whole thing about speaking in tongues and praying and doing your worship songs. That was very much a part of what this church was like. But, I mean, I don't know about you, but I didn't get anything out of it for the first few years because we were just dragged along and we would just hang out with our friends.
It was more of a social thing for us because we didn't have, there was people, a lot of the friends we made through church, they didn't go to the same school. So that was our chance to catch up with, the likes of, Rachel and stuff who didn't go to the school. So that was kind of probably more for us social. And when we were younger, we went to Sunday school, which I think goes up till the age of 12, maybe. Maybe a bit younger. And the best part about that was being able to leave when the sermon started, to be honest. And secondly, they gave us cordial and arrowroot biscuits with butter on. So that's what I was living for.
Ugh.
But the first part of the service was always the singing part, and I remember, Mum telling me to get up, stand up. Like I was not allowed to sit during the singing, and she would grab me under the arm and make me stand up, and I had to sing. I couldn't just stand up; I had to sing.
Well, because Mum and Dad both pride themselves on basically singing the loudest. Yes,
very loud. And actually, it's embarrassing when you're that age and everyone's like, "Oh, I heard you singing from across the way."
Yeah. And Mum and Dad loved that, and I'm like, "Oh my God, it's exactly the opposite feeling."
Yes, but I used to hate that it was forced. So I think I probably rebelled against that a bit.
I remember playing basically in the back, playing underneath the chairs.
Yeah,
trying to hide beneath the chairs, and then adults coming over and telling us off. And it's always the worst when someone else, another adult in church, comes and tells you off. Very embarrassing for Mum.
Well, I remember sitting under the chairs too with Rosie, a friend of mine who used to eat crackers, and I'd sit with her under the chairs, and she'd be crunching really loudly her crackers through the service. Usually,
the other thing I remembered was having to, we'd go into the back room when there was no Sunday school program, usually at the evening services for church, and we'd end up watching Anne of Green Gables or Chitty Chitty Bang Bang or Sound of Music.
On the TV,
oh my God, like those movies are basically ruined for me because there were only about 3 or 4 movies that they owned at the church, and it was just the same ones every time.
Yeah. Yeah, the church video or VHS library was very small.
I think probably things changed for me when I started playing drums at church, which I think was around about the age of 14, maybe approximately. So I had showed an interest in music already as when I was quite young. I had started singing. Well, I liked singing, at school events and stuff. I don't really remember how that happened. I remember people saying that I could sing when I was at primary school, and I don't know, it didn't mean anything to me. But then when we started going to the Christian school, I was doing a bit more music then. I don't remember how it began, but I remember I joined the music team as a drummer, and yeah, it just meant that I was around church a lot more for practices, and it just meant I had to be responsible, which is weird because I'm still young, but then all of a sudden it's like you have this responsibility to kind of help a bunch of adults get into church, enjoy church a bit more. It's a bit of a strange scenario, really. But it kind of made me feel a bit important, I remember at the time. And especially when people would come up and can say how well I'd done. But then at the same time, there was some really kind of old traditional people there who were really against what I was doing. Like, this is the weird thing about Christianity, right? Because drumming. So drumming was very controversial back in the 90s. and older people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, church movements were very against drums because they were supposedly reminiscent of witchcraft or witch doctors banging away on their drums. I don't know. I mean, it's ridiculous now in hindsight, but I suppose that you can kind of understand if you put yourself in that context of what they're thinking, but
just people that weren't ready for change, right?
They just need to fucking loosen up. They just didn't know how to have a good time. Yeah, some very respected members of the church community actually had came up to me. I was just a kid saying that they thought that I was good at it, but I probably shouldn't be doing it in church. I do remember that very vividly.
Ridiculous, really.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have had any concept of that either. Somebody would have just said, "Oh, you're a good drummer. Do you want to be part of the team?" So
yeah, I mean,
to go up to say that to a child is kind of like at that age too.
Yeah,
when you're quite impressionable and.
Well, I was just lucky I stayed in it, to be honest. But I think it must have been around that time that we got involved in the youth group, and I don't know if there was a youth group before that.
No, there wasn't. It started. I guess they noticed there was a need for it because there was lots of families started maybe who had kids around that age.
The church was going through a bit of a growth phase, I think, through those years. And yeah, they had a need to kind of cater to the needs of the young people, whatever that is, which sounds ridiculous. But it's one of those things that successful growing churches are supposed to have. They're supposed to have a youth
and when you're that age, actually it was kind of fun because they made it, although yes it had an undercurrent of doing sort of Christian things, we'd also arrange to do fun things on a Friday night, so it was again a chance to socialize.
I don't remember much of those early years of youth group. It became a really big part of our lives, for me especially, I think, because that's where I made my closest friends. But I don't remember doing a lot of fun stuff.
Well, so obviously you being a bit older, you were able to join earlier than me because I think it was from age 12. So I remember being like jealous of you going to youth group because it was on a Friday night. But I know when I started, some of my earliest memories was it being absolute chaos, like us running around the church.
Oh, yeah, it was like games and stuff, right?
Yeah, games, like fun stuff like that. And we even had a sleeper over at the church. We put all the chairs together, those old school chairs, and put our sleeping bags on it. And, I think, it was just like the social aspect of it was fun. It was fun being around your friends and mucking around. And
yeah, it was a good time. It wasn't
so serious at that point in terms of, later on was when we did more, we'd go to other churches and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, when we got into our mid-teen years, I think it became more serious in terms of the messaging. And
then they'd reeled us in with the fun games.
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's what youth group is, let's be honest. But, our youth pastor had a very strong message, and she had I mean, we respected her, but she had quite a tough grip on us as a group. Very, very influential.
She was quite intimidating. I found her intimidating.
She was. I mean, I don't know if I found her intimidating. For me, it was more respect. So I respected her more than I respected the pastor / principal, as we covered last time. He was both. I didn't have a good relationship with him because, remember he rubbed out all my work. So screw that guy. But the youth pastor,
hopefully he's not listening.
I don't know. I just respected her a lot more.
I mean, I found myself
more on our level,
seeking her approval because I don't know if that was respect or that I was slightly scared of her. So I wanted to do stuff to impress and make her notice me.
I mean, that's so how it works in church, though, with respecting leaders, and definitely a feature of much of my years at church was, and I only realized this looking back and on reflection, but I was just constantly trying to meet somebody else's expectations of who I should be and what I should be doing. And I think our youth pastor, she was generally quite gentle in the way that she did it, but she was very black and white. Very black and white in the way that she viewed the world and what also our behavior should be, for sure. But most of the time she was quite gentle with us.
Well, she was, but there was definitely another side to her. I will never forget the day that she humiliated me in front of all of my friends about a private matter. And I remember going home, this was on a youth group camp. I remember going home to Mum and just bawling my eyes out and telling her what she did. And Mum was absolutely furious, and she went and had words with her, and she backed off me then. But
yeah, it was kind of interesting, their relationship there, because as we covered briefly last time, there was a lot of blurred lines between those who had kind of authority over us, because it was such a small community. But
they were also close friends with Mum and Dad.
That's what I'm saying. So you would kind of go from one bubble into the next without even realizing, from Mum and Dad's level at least. And, we would go from, you and I would go from having the youth pastor in that position of authority over us, and the same with the pastor, the senior pastor. And then all of a sudden we'd be having lunch at their house with Mum and Dad and then trying to negotiate that. But of course we were expected to treat them exactly the same. Yeah. That was really confusing.
It is, yeah.
And I felt like I could never switch off.
No.
Ever. Like I was always trying to do the right thing in front of them, and that's what Mum and Dad expected of us.
And also calling them, Mr. So-and-so. It's always been that, because that person was an authority, whether we were just having casual lunch at their house or whether, we were at church. It was always, Mr. and Mrs.
Yeah.
Which, like you say, it's very confusing when it's sort of that grey area, like, can I be myself in this relaxed environment, or do I still need to be,
Yeah. Anyway, maybe we could just talk a little bit about the youth group itself and some of the things that we did, because I have some very clear memories about, when you're a teenager, there are specific things that we're going through in our development, and how the way that they tried to address those in youth group was quite awkward, to say the least. One particular big thing for a young person is growing up with learning about relationships and sex and just boys and girls in general, just learning how to negotiate those hormones and stuff. And apart from just ignoring it completely, which is often what took place in church, definitely in our family, we just never ever talked about that stuff. Ever. Ever.
Don't even mention it.
Oh my God.
Like even body anatomy, don't even mention it.
Oh my God. And in terms of sex ed for us, we did have it in school, but not from a person.
I didn't.
It was in a book. We talked about the books, the paces. Paces, is that what they call them?
Yeah.
The books, right? In science, there was a small section about anatomy and what happens. Like it was literally a few paragraphs or a page or whatever. And as expected, was in the test, and that was it. Like it was never expanded on by an adult, so we didn't get any education on it.
And being a small school, we didn't have physical biology teachers, or it was literally just
at all. So it was a complete gap in our education. We were all aware of it because I don't know, but you just pick things up from people. It happens at school. People talk about things, but it becomes really warped because no one really knows exactly
what to do.
Even the word like period, for example. Some of the boys would talk about periods and whispers, they didn't want to, and they were trying to figure out, do you think if girls, is it like this for girls, or does this happen? And, you know what I heard the other day?
Chinese whispers.
It's kind of like secret, and you don't really know what's 100% true. And I remember very, very vividly, I must have been about 16, I guess. We had a night, it was a youth night, where the girls and the guys got split up and they had to go to different places, and they had all these fun activities for the boys. And when we say fun activities for boys, it's very kind of classic masculine activities, right? So boys are in church, as we all know, they're supposed to fit a certain, and women of course, but I can only speak from my side, but men are supposed to fit a certain stereotype of they want to get rough and dirty and lots of big belly laughs and silly jokes, and kind of farts are funny and jokes, shit jokes, and like literally, and just bad jokes. I don't know, like, those classic stereotypes. And it's no different in church. In fact, they are almost enforced because that's just the way that we church is very gendered. Christianity is very gendered. Anyway, we're split up into these two groups, and it was supposed to be a fun night. And then at the kind of like the pinnacle of the night, we sat down. So the boys are at our house, and we all sat down on the lounge in a circle, and one of the guys was trying to very awkwardly talk about, what is something that, guys of your age are always interested in? And we're all looking at each other blankly.
I don't know.
Literally no one had an answer. Or most accurately, because there were some who were older than myself at that time, who would definitely have known. They just didn't want to talk about it because they felt too awkward to admit that they would have anything to do with girls. And one of the other guys who was also a visitor, remember Ben, who was staying at our house, who was like in his 20s. He was like, "You're all liars. It's girls. Of course it's girls." And we're all looking at each other. I'd never really thought about girls before because we didn't talk about them.
Yeah.
Who were they going to talk about girls with? It was such a taboo topic, and it was so awkward. And he tried to talk us through like what's okay about between boys and girls, but it meant nothing to me. And I don't remember anything that he said, to be honest, because it was so wishy-washy and didn't really have a point. There was never any practical education on anything to do with that, except that girls and boys, it was just reinforcing that we should be separated, literally separated, and also figuratively talking about how different we are. It was men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That was very much how it was through my whole church years, to be honest, that guys and girls are different, and anything to do with sex is bad.
And you weren't even allowed in the same room alone with someone of the other sex.
No, and like very easily get in trouble.
Yeah.
You get told on and get in big trouble. Yeah. I don't know if you remember any of those things.
No, I don't really have any memories of that kind of stuff from youth group at all. But I mean, I do remember at that time, when you're going through puberty, having lots of crushes, but I didn't. Yeah, I mean, because I had no understanding.
I had some major crushes. But the thing is, because I had all these feelings, but I had no one to talk about them with. And because you're growing up, you hear stuff. You hear things about girls and about boys and what they can and can't do. And you, of course, you imagine these things. You can't even stop your brain from doing that. It's just part of being a teenager. But the guilt that came with those thoughts was just so immense. And so I guess most of my fanciful imaginations were just almost purely romantic, because I wanted to separate myself so much so from the dirty, dirty stuff that came with relationships, quote unquote dirty. So I probably the purest love I've ever felt in my life, because it was so disassociated from anything that could be considered impure. And it really kind of messed me up in terms of what can be expected in a relationship, or how you're supposed to relate to girls when you those first stages of trying to learn to relate to a girl. And of course, I'm talking about this as a purely heterosexual man, right? So learning how to negotiate those first awkward steps with a girl, I just did not know anything. It took me years to kind of figure that out, and years of awkwardness, I should say. And so that when later on, when I got into my first relationship, it was messed up. It was fucked from the beginning.
And it was probably, you were probably set up for failure, really, because we had no tools in our kit on how to be in a relationship at all, because we didn't have, I can't even think of any examples to give of where it was something even close to a relationship. So yeah, it was really hard to describe in feelings and emotions how that time was when you're like, you talk about having a crush, and it's like, what do I do with these feelings? Where do I go with this? Yeah. And yeah, like, it's not like you could go and talk to your parents about it. I mean, I went to Anna and talked to her, and we'd laugh and giggle, and she'd laugh when the following week I'd have a different crush. And I don't know, it was a weird time to navigate these feelings when you didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah. And I think we'll probably expand a little bit more on these youth group years in our next episode, because there's so much more to share about these teenage years. So much more. But I guess I just want to finish off on a final anecdote on this topic. I don't know if you remember this, Briar, but at home we used to listen to this Christian radio station. That was the only thing we were allowed to listen to, basically, outside of the Radio New Zealand broadcasts. And every evening there would be a focus. It was a program called Focus on the Family, which was from the US, and it was basically like a 30-minute time slot every evening, and they would have there was a children's show, and then they would have a speaker of some description who would basically a sermon. And once there was a sermon about, I don't even know what the topic was, but I remember we were just sitting, you and I were sitting in the lounge, and then Mum and Dad came in, and they were like, "Oh, what the session tonight? I think this is something that we probably should listen to as a family, because I think this is going to be it'll be really good for you to listen to." And it's about, this guy was going to be sharing things about relationships, and talking about girls and boys and how they relate to each other, and about marriage or whatever. I can't remember specifics, but I remember we started listening to this guy speak. About 5 minutes in, he talks about how he was talking about a story about how a guy had been basically preparing to get married, and he didn't use the direct words, but he was describing how this boy was getting really horny, and in Christian terms, and then he used a specific phrase, like, on their wedding night, he just went on her like Conan. I don't know why I remember this. And then very quickly, Mum was like, "Oh, I think that's all we need to hear about that." And then she switched it off, and then they walked away, and that was it. That was our sex ed. They didn't talk to us about it. There was no explanation. I didn't understand their discomfort. That was it. So safe to say we both grew up without really knowing anything about relationships and sex. And I mean, my first relationship, major relationship, became a massive part of my life. I was pretty much a teenager when that began. So it's no surprise that didn't go so well. And that's an episode on its own. But this is basically with the roots of all of that. It was just so messed up that you were supposed to be, everything is within the bounds of marriage, of course, when you talk about relationships in a church context, and that's it. And we do not talk about anything before. It's only after marriage, and after marriage, you talk about it with your partner. Mm-hmm. That's it. Yep. And so consequently, I mean, the church has got a lot to answer for in this respect. And also, but consequently, you get these people getting together, they don't know what to do.
No, that's what I was just going to say. The people you marry are people from the church who, if they're young, a lot of them are, nobody has a effing clue what to do and where to start. So it's no surprise that a lot of them fail.
Yeah, and we will definitely deal with this when both you and I, obviously, we have, spoiler alert, but have experience with marriage and failing marriages as well, and a massive part of our lives. And I think we'll probably have to do a whole episode on those chapters, because there's so much to unpack there, not just for our stories, but the background as well, that kind of pushed us into those situations in the first place. But I think we'll probably leave it there for now, because we could just go on and on about this stuff. But this is our second episode on the kind of the middle teenage years, I guess, and there's some more ground to cover. In our next episode, we'll continue on with this. Please tune in again, and we look forward to divulging further stories from the past with you then. Thanks.
Bye.